Hey, how's it going, everybody? Sean here for another movie review. If you're watching this on our alternate YouTube channel, make sure to go check out the description and go subscribe at our main channel, the main Zoobox channel. This is just kind of when Zoobox gets put on ice for a little bit, a couple weeks at a time, we use this channel. But anyways, so today we're going to be talking about the recently released in 2021 movie Candyman. The film is directed by DaCosta. It is written by Jordan Peele, Wynn Rosenfield, DaCosta. It stars Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, Teyonah Parris, Nathan Stewart Jarrett, Coleman Domingo, Kyle Kaminski, Vanessa Williams, not the same one though, Miriam Moss, Brian King, and others. The logline plot synopsis is a sequel to the horror film Candyman from 1992, directed by Bernard Rose, that returns to the now gentrified Chicago neighborhood where the legend began. So yeah, so this is technically a sequel to the old Candyman. It's really like a soft reboot. You know, they want this new guy, Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, to kind of take over the franchise and be the new Candyman. And he may get his day too, because even though the reviews for this have not been super well, it's doing very well at the box office. So just my short little brief history with the franchise or the movie, the old Candyman movies. I think that they're okay. I think the first one is the best one by a pretty wide margin. I actually rewatched it in anticipation of seeing the new one just to kind of get a refresher. And it's a very solid, just kind of gothic thriller horror movie. Not my favorite. I don't think the whole thing works, but I do think it's a fairly compelling little kind of journey, a little mystery story, a little mystery thriller. A lot of people like to kind of lump Tony Todd and Candyman. He kind of stands next to like Freddy Krueger and Jason and stuff. I've never really felt that way about the character. And if you go watch the old Candyman, you know, when I use the term gothic, I think that's the most appropriate thing. It's like kind of melodrama, and it's not really about crazy kills. It's not really about that. It's just about kind of this impending sense of doom, this foreboding sense of dread that Bernard Rose, as a director, really is effective at putting across. And also the original score for Candyman, that original piece of music, which I think is what, what's his name? Let me look it up real quick. Philip Glass. Philip Glass's main theme for Candyman is fantastic. And I've actually, since I watched the movie last week, it's been like stuck in my head the whole time. But this one, so let's go for this one. So this one is directly dealing with parts, concepts from the original Candyman. It fleshes out and demystifies the character in a way that I thought was really dumb and not interesting. Not to say that it's not really in line with the old Candyman, but I have this thing where I really hate when people just speak the subtext of the movie. They just say it out loud. It's like, oh, this is about gentrification. They say it like about 10 times in the beginning of the movie, because as the story kind of surrounds this artist, Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, he's a up and coming artist, and he dates some rich girl that's involved in the art world, and he's doing a piece, an installation, or that he wants to build out into an installation about Candyman and about gentrification and about trauma and the cycles of violence and how those things they're met upon one person and then it goes to the next generation, which is in line with the basic concept of who Candyman is or what Candyman represents. This kind of the id of vengeance from days of yore, from your past, not your past literally, but like your family's legacy and the things that they went through, and Candyman kind of represents that. And there was always kind of a confusion in the original Candyman because his targets were like poor black people. So there was kind of a dissonance there about what they were trying to say with the character. It was a little mixed up. It's something I think they kind of address in later movies. I can't remember. It's been a long time since I've seen them. But in this one, they directly address it. And it's all about that. And it's all about the old neighborhood, the Cabrini something or other. It's old Chicago neighborhood that has been gentrified, and now the new Candyman is there to, I guess, make gentrifiers pay, for lack of a better way to put it. And there's a bunch of kind of commentary about that, and it's just doesn't really do much with it. There's not a lot of substance there. It's just almost like saying like, oh no, we're talking about important things. Don't you see? We're talking about things that are important. You should totally think this is deep and interesting. And it just never really quite connects. And I think a lot of that has to do with how streamlined it is. This movie, if you were to cut out like the credits and stuff, it's like 80 minutes long. It's a very tight movie. Well, I wouldn't even use the word tight. I would say this is an anemic movie. There is nothing on these bones. There is nothing interesting with these characters, barely at all. And it's not that's not a problem with like the actors. Everybody is great for the most part in terms of like their performances. And I actually would say this, to credit the director, DaCosta here, she has a really good handle on creating kind of tension and atmosphere. But the way their angle on this, just making a Candyman movie, was much more in line with kind of a typical rote slasher movie, which is not how I felt about the original, like especially revisiting it recently. Like I said, I think there was a little bit more to it than that. And this one kind of isn't. It's just kind of watching people get knocked off one by one, and you kind of understand why, and you're just like, well, okay, sure. And then the way it ends too, it just gets even more and more ridiculous. But there's like a big reveal when you find out who the main character is and what that's supposed to represent, and how this kind of is part of the larger Candyman legacy that I thought was just contrived, just kind of dumb, unnecessary, especially considering how they had built out the concept of the Candyman and what a Candyman actually is like in folklore, and what the menacing spirit of Candyman represents. They didn't have to link it as directly as they decided to in this movie. I was kind of confused. I was just like, why would we do this? It has that small world syndrome that I think is a little, I don't know, just boring, predictable. I had a notion in my head. I was like, I have a feeling this is who this person is, pretty early on into the movie, even though the movie doesn't do anything necessarily to tip its hat, which I suppose you could say is another problem the movie has. It just isn't paced very well, and it doesn't build things out. But it feels like this thing had its guts ripped out of it. I mean, it is very lean movie. Goes by super fast. Things go by so fast, like you don't even have a breath. There's not even a breath you can take to kind of take it in, maybe understand and sit with the characters and sit with what just happens. It's like, no, we're just barreling forward to the next thing, the next slasher moment. But like I said, DaCosta does a good job, I think, executing those scenes, though. Even I think in a vacuum they work, but as part of the larger piece, it kind of just left me wanting. And especially coming from having just watched the original Candyman, which I would say, if you're going to watch the new one, watch the original 1992 one. It doesn't really deal with anything that I saw with the sequels. It is mostly just the direct sequel to the first one, which is kind of par for the course these days, with Halloween and whatnot. But yeah, didn't have huge expectations, so I can't say like me being underwhelmed is that big of a deal, honestly. It's kind of like, well, what did you expect? What did you expect? And I have not seen this director's other work. Obviously, Jordan Peele being associated with it, I knew that it was going to have, or I expected it to be about like a more social commentary. It was going to lean a lot heavier on that, and it totally does. It just does it in a very kind of childish, pedantic way. There's actually a scene in the movie where the main character, Abdul Mateen's character, is talking to like an art critic. And they're talking about his work, and they're talking about this new Candyman thing that he wants to do, this series he wants to do. And she basically makes the comment at some point, or she does it a few times, that like, oh, you people are you're responsible for gentrification. And he's like, does the whole like you people thing, because they're trying to say that this is like she's microaggressing against him. Basically, that's the inference. But what she's really talking about is artists, and she makes a fantastic point about upper middle class or rich kid artists that don't want to fucking pay high rents, so they move into bad neighborhoods, they move into little shadier areas, and they begin that gentrification process because their presence makes like a market or whatever you want to call it. They're going to have different needs that need to be filled in those neighborhoods. So you have industry will move in a different way. Then people are going to start looking at these apartments like, oh, look at all these all these kids with money down there not paying anything for rent. Well, what if we start buying these apartment buildings and cleaning them up and then charging 3 times the amount? That's part of the process of gentrification, and it's what happens. And it's not even like a newer critique. I think I even saw this critique in The Impossible Kimmy Schmidt? Is that what it's called? Kimmy Schmidt, that Netflix show, the one that's kind of like 30 Rock. It's Tina Fey. There's an episode of that where they make basically the same observation, where it's like the hipsters have moved in, and then now like a Starbucks appears. Oh, that's kind of what happens. And the movie kind of rejects it, like she's being passive-aggressive racist because he's a black guy. So him being a black artist, even though he is exactly what she's saying, is different. It's different because he's from that neighborhood. So how can he be gentrifying it, even though his position and his tastes are what they are, right? So there's a lot of confusing things like that and it never develops any of it really in any kind of substantial, interesting way, especially like the final moments of the film. So I'm going to just spoil the last couple minutes of the movie. So if you don't want to see spoilers, you shut it off here. But I was pretty disappointed in this movie. I think it's very slick and stylish, but it's pretty ephemeral and completely forgettable. I'd be surprised if I remember this next week, really any of the finer details of it, which may be a consequence of watching so many movies, but hey, if you're good enough, you stay in the old gray matter. I'll remember it. So at the end of the movie, there's been this guy who's kind of like like this guy's Abdul Mateen's source of information. He's like a laundryman. What does he do? I'm trying to find the actor here. I can't find him. Whatever. There's a guy that he gets information from, and he's like obsessed with turning this new dude, like artificially creating the circumstances and the trauma to create a new Candyman. And he does this because you find out the main character is the baby that Virginia Madsen saves in the original Candyman. He's the baby, and the Candyman had touched him, had chosen him. But Virginia Madsen basically takes his place, becomes a sacrifice in a way. And if you've seen the original Candyman, there's an implication that people that are wronged, that have suffered trauma, and that are gaslit and are abused in different ways, they can kind of become the specter. They can become their own version of Candyman. And in this one, it's much more like literal and direct. It's not like anybody could be Candyman. It's like it has to do with like this literal process. And this guy wants this young dude, the main character, to become the new Candyman, so he kind of goes about ways of making that happen. And it's not very clear. Maybe I'm missing something from the last like 20 minutes of that movie, but it really hits the accelerator, and it's like a jumbled mess. But the dude like cuts off the kid's arm and shoves a spike into it and all sorts of stuff. And then there's an altercation with the police and the woman that his girlfriend's like in the backseat of the police car, and the police officer's like, because they shot this dude with the hook hand, Abdul Mateen, and he's like, doing the racist white cop thing where he's like, well, what were we supposed to think? If you don't want to go with that story, maybe you were an accomplice. Maybe you were holding him down. So she looks in the rearview mirror and invokes Candyman, and then so now Candyman comes and like, I'm trying to remember, does he kill the cops? I think he kills at least one or two of them. So now he's just like an avenger. He's just like the spirit avenging downtrodden, abused black communities. I'm like, that's not the fucking character of Candyman. Unless maybe that's what they're just saying. They're saying like, well, Candyman can really be motivated by anything. And if this guy he's the Candyman with a heart of gold. So, he can be whatever he wants, dude. Don't limit him. But it just kind of takes away that gothic horror, that kind of melodramatic quality that the original movie has, and the original character Candyman has, the Tony Todd version of the character now, I suppose you'd say. There's something about like the original Tony Todd one that's like kind of just like feels wrapped in history, and it feels tragic, and it shows you that like violence begets violence and evil begets evil, and the Candyman, while he's like this kind of vengeful spirit, is also indiscriminate. He doesn't really care. He's just like a force of nature, an id. And in this one, it was like he was like a Marvel hero at the end. It was like watching the birth of a Marvel hero. Because if they do anything in the future, like how can they really make Candyman really be the villain? He's not. They've positioned him as kind of like a heroic presence. And Candyman, and then there's, and there is qualities to Candyman that's like Freddy Krueger, where it's like, well, if people don't believe in Candyman, just like all folklore, it loses its power, it loses its status. So you had, in the original movie, you had Virginia Madsen doing the investigating. That's what kind of brings Candyman back into the community. And now you have, in this movie, you have this artist who found the folklore, heard the stories, thought it was just an interesting subject. So now he's kind of invoking Candyman, but also at the same time bringing it back. And I don't know. It was just kind of muddled. It's like you can see what they're doing. You see what they're attempting to achieve, and they fall very short of it. And I think it's just because it tries to do too many things at one time. It doesn't spend enough time with the characters. It doesn't let them breathe at all. They've kind of demystified Candyman in a way that is lame and kind of uninteresting and takes his power away a little bit. There's even a little cameo with Tony Todd at the end, kind of invoking this idea of like, tell people, make them remember, so that Candyman can still exist. He can still be kind of a presence in these communities, keep people on the right path, the straight and narrow, which I think is kind of like what ends up being quote unquote the villain. That's like kind of his plan. He wants Candyman to come back, not just for revenge, but to keep people in line. It's good to have a boogeyman kind of thing, right? It's good to have something in your life that you're afraid of. And so many people are secular and have fallen away from God. All these drug dealers and gangbangers and gentrifiers and all this stuff. They're not afraid of anything supernatural. So we need this meta presence of morality and like keeping people in line. And that's what Candyman would represent to him. But I wish the movie kind of dealt more with that stuff. I wish it had gotten into those things. It just doesn't really have much interest in it. And it's just kind of a kill a bunch of white people slasher movie. I think everybody that dies, pretty much, especially from Candyman, I want to say they're all white. I could be wrong. Like I said, it's kind of forgettable. Kind of just washes over you and you're like, oh, okay. All right. I guess I watched that. But anyways, yeah, I think that's going to do it for that little review. I don't know. I know not going to be no editing, no fancy stuff for this one. Just wanted to put something up because I hadn't done anything in a few days. But anyways, we'll talk to you guys later. And maybe skip Candyman 2021. Maybe embrace Candyman 1992. All right, goodbye.